Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and I thank all of our panelists for being here today. The U.S. bond markets are incredibly important to our economy. They allow companies of all sizes to raise capital, to expand their businesses, hire more employees, or invest in new equipment. U.S. company raised a record $1.5 trillion in the bond market in 2015. But it isn't just corporations that raise money in the bond markets. All types of loans, from mortgages to auto loans, are funded in the securitization markets. So these markets are a key part of our economy, and it is appropriate for us to review the state of these markets. However, we also need to keep in mind that the securitization markets, particularly for subprime mortgages, was a source of a lot of problems during the financial crisis. Many of the banks that were making the mortgage loans or packaging together mortgage-backed securities did not retain any of the risk for themselves, which meant that they didn't have a strong incentive to make sure that the loans were high quality and that the borrowers could afford them. Dodd-Frank addressed this problem by requiring that the sponsors of securitizations retain at least 5% of the risk on their own balance sheets. This rule, known as the risk retention rule, was intended to align the interest of the sponsors with the interest of the investors in the securitization. If the underlying loans go bad, both the sponsor and the investor will suffer. Former Chairman Barney Frank called the risk retention rule, and I quote, "the single biggest issue that we dealt with in Dodd-Frank." Two of the bills that we're considering today would codify exemptions to the risk retention rule that go beyond what the regulators determined was appropriate. One bill would broaden the exemption for commercial real estate loans from the risk retention rule, while the other would create a new exemption for securitizations of certain corporate loans. While I'm interested in hearing from our witnesses on these bills, I think we should be very careful about rolling back such an important rule, which was one of the most important aspects of Dodd-Frank, especially before the rule has even taken effect. The third bill that we're considering today is sponsored by my good friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano. His bill would make a technical fix to the Volcker rule that would avoid the need for banks to rename huge numbers of funds for no good reason. The Volcker rule prohibits banks from owning hedge funds or private equity funds, and I believe this is critically important because it prevents banks from taking on the risks that come with hedge funds and private equity funds, which are not appropriate for banks. However, the Volcker rule does allow banks, under limited circumstances, to organize and offer hedge funds and private equity funds. In other words, the bank can help get the fund started, but once the fund is up and running, the bank cannot have a significant ownership stake in the fund. One condition of this exception for getting a fund started is that the bank and the fund can't share the same name or a variation of the same name. The intent of this name-sharing ban was to ensure that banks don't feel obligated for reputational reasons to bail out a fund that is initially organized. By a quirk of the way the Volcker rule was drafted, however, this name-changing ban applies not just to the bank's name, but also to any investment advisor that is affiliated with the bank, even if the investment advisor has a completely different name than the bank. It's not clear to me how this furthers the original goal of deterring banks from bailing out funds that they organized, since the fund would have a completely different name than the bank. So I look forward to the discussion of Mr. Capuano's bill and the other two bills and the testimony today. Thank you very much, and I yield back. Thank you.